Welcome to the Material Advantage podcast. We're covering everything that business leaders need to know to stay ahead of the materials and chemicals transition. I'm Rachel Myall.
I'm Dan Noakes.
This podcast will cut through noise and give clear direction about what is likely to work or not, and which secure, resilient, decarbonised, circular, non-toxic, non-polluting technologies are really going to scale over the next 10 to 20 years. My background, so I have spent 20 years bringing the right people together to drive change. I've got a background in commercial strategy, partnerships and behaviour change. I then spent 10 years building technology, innovation and investment events across food, agriculture, water, waste, and specifically materials and chemicals, and now run my own business providing innovation intelligence, warm introductions between manufacturers, brands, suppliers, startups, universities, governments and investors, and hands-on implementation as well to embrace new solutions and new technologies. Dan, how about you?
Well, thank you, Rachel. I've got 20 years in sustainability and circular economy, scaling clean technologies and supply chain circular economy programs, including in the bioprocessing and products sector, as well as chemical processes like advanced thermal and chemical recycling, working to help novel startup companies develop novel materials, and doing this at a government innovation centre for the best part of over a decade. But I now lead my own company, Neon, which focuses on supply chain challenges, bringing stakeholders together and accessing funding and financing that really can focus that supply chain down on resilience and resource security.
And we have a lot of conversations about the drivers behind the demand for alternatives. There's a lot going on in the world today, all impacting how companies do business, regulatory pressures, consumer awareness. We've got investor pressure, insurers backing out of covering certain products, PFAS, for example. We've got geopolitical insecurity. Everyone knows what's going on in the world, environmental impact as well. So there's a bit of a perfect storm, it feels like, driving demand for alternatives. I mean, there's an argument McKinsey has put out there that demand will outstrip supply over the next few decades. So what happens then? Who are going to be the winners? Who are going to be the early adopters and really benefit? But there's also been significant and continues to be significant technological advances, some really exciting things in engineering biology, for example. And I guess there's two reasons that I wanted to do this podcast. There's acknowledging all of that going on and what that means for materials and chemicals innovation and who the winners are going to be, who's funding them, which technologies, which feedstocks. But also through the last 10 years, I've really noticed a gap between incredible technologies, incredible solutions, and commercial reality. How are companies going to scale? And obviously, that's a lot of your background.
Right, Rachel, that's hit a lot of truth within me and what I've seen. But the truth is, everybody is competing for the same investment, it seems. But the challenge for the market is not everybody's focused on solving a problem, and there are a finite number of resources out there, especially in the finance sector. So it's important that businesses focus on challenges that are relevant to the situation of today. And staying relevant as a company is part of staying resilient. As you've mentioned before, geopolitical conflicts, global warming, pollution, they're all seen as threats to business as usual. But in fact, they are economic opportunities for those that are willing to take leadership in social and environmental stewardship. This is a major wealth generator for the next 20 years for those that commit to it. So for me, you've said before, this podcast should cut through noise in our industry and focus down on the real challenges in materials and do it in an honest way. If we can give clear direction to what can work and what will work, I think we can speak to business leaders who are looking to technology to help them really give a return on investment, but also future-proof them in a marketplace of tomorrow. How do you feel about that?
We've talked about this a lot. When we talk about environmental impact, sustainability, it's not just looking after the plants and the animals and the trees. There's a real harsh reality that supply chains are getting massively hit by flooding and other extreme weather events, water scarcity as well. So it's not just a nice to have anymore. There's just a bare reality that if businesses don't rethink where they get their materials from and how and in what volume, they're going to be left behind. I mean, if nothing else, oil is finite and is likely to go up in price at some point in the future. Similarly, there's a lot of talk at the moment around critical metals and minerals as well, at the same time as waste is increasing all around the world, and especially in the Western world, a lot of electronics are just being dumped. There's huge value there for whichever companies can work that out and tap into it and use that as feedstock, as a circular business model in the future. So my particular view with all of this is similar to what you said earlier. There is a commercial opportunity here. The world is changing. I think massive difference with social media and just consumer awareness about where things are coming from and what people are putting on their skin. What are they dressing their children in? There was a huge increase in Google searches around the plastic detox, and it became a global trend, and they categorized that as a search term that has increased by 5,000% since last week. And of course, regulation.
Well, yes, it's interesting because regulation, people always think that today's regulation is the thing that's causing people to make change or to start to act in a different way to how it always done. But the truth of the matter is that regulation was set late 90s, mid to late 90s. And over time, that regulation, specifically in the EU, it's been tightening. And it's now getting to that inevitable point where businesses do have to choose to adapt or continue to feel some of the pain from, as you said, the feedstock end supplying into that business, or are they producing the right products in the first place that the markets actually need, consumers actually need, and it's right for the world we live in today? So companies need to choose the right regulatory landscape that they're willing to contribute to, because it's gonna affect how they operate their businesses in any case. In terms of emerging technologies, I would say that we've already seen a lot of them in the past. Actually, what we need now is late scale technologies, making generating new academic studies in this space is great, but we need technologies to finally reach the marketplace. And I'm hoping that we are now at a time where some of the great materials that are renewable, some of the great materials that have come from secondary raw materials are now starting to stick within a marketplace, and we will continue to have the patience and tolerance to help invest those companies that are bringing them to market.
I mean, the time it takes to get to that point is talked about a lot. So Amsilk, for example, 15 years in the making, doing really well at the moment, but it took 15 years. I mentioned before we started recording actually that there's a company in Germany called Traceless, and this was one of my highlight stories from last week. Company in Germany using ag residues to create non-plastic materials. Actually, they've managed to get to industrial scale in 6 years. But what's very interesting there is the regional backing that they've had from governments, federal level and regional level as well. Businesses like Otto, which is a German e-commerce company. And obviously there's been a lot going on over the last 6 years with COVID, with Trump, certain political decisions that have been made and economic impacts. And they've managed to push through all of that and get to this point. And I firmly believe it is because these people in Germany, these companies in Germany, wanted to ensure that Traceless was a success story. So this does tap into what we talk about, which is how do these technologies scale? Is there one path that everybody needs to follow? Is it only possible with that country level backing? What would you say is the one or maybe one, two, or three things that will actually ensure a company succeeds?
Well, looking at the type of technology that they're trying to scale, is it a product or is it a process? If it's a process, that comes with higher risk, larger investment usually, and longer. If it's a product, you can get a product to market a lot quicker. All you're doing is meeting the needs of the buyer. Whereas a process, you've got to hit robustness, you've got to hit performance guarantees. You've got to overcome some of the, or mitigate some of the cost basis around energy, around water fed into the process, the waste it produced. So processes, they have to compete on a different level now because they've got to be as efficient as the best technology on the market, if not better, in order to be adopted. But it also has to produce the types of margins and yields that will give you a product output that will sustain a return on investment. It's got really hard to achieve in the current climate a technology that can actually make commercialization. Whereas a product, if a product meets an attribute and it's at the right price, it does exactly what the incumbent does, if not better, and it's scalable, then generally a product's more likely to be invested in because you can very easily build a business plan out of numbers that you've got a secure margin. The process is hard, and that's where we need tolerance and patience from investors like impact investors that are willing to work over the longer term, not short-term thinking.
And we've seen an increase over here in Europe amongst universities, for example, have become increasingly more like American universities, commercially oriented, spinning out startups, spinning out their own entities. What you were just talking about just reminded me that you've still got to go back to the basics of running a business and growing a business. It doesn't matter what the technology is, it doesn't matter what the process is or the feedstock, it's just going back to basics. And there are some startups out there that have an incredible vision or mission or idea, but actually making that a reality is a completely different ball game. And I know that you've had personal experience of this and worked with quite a few companies to get them into a commercial ready stage. You've mentioned three things to me, for example, that a technology or a company really needs to tick in terms of boxes. One being manufacturability, and there were two others.
I tend to see the products that are adopted in the material space a lot faster, Rachel, are the ones that can just drop into existing technology processes, sunk assets that are used around the world, injection molding, thermoforming, 3D printing from the additive manufacturing. So if you can drop into those processes without any significant technology change, if it's just a software switch or it's a few changes on settings on machines, then it comes down to, does it do the thing at the back end that the original material did, and how much is it? And depending on the policy environmental regulation landscape, price becomes a discussion rather than a sticking point. So
Mm.
where do I feel the challenge for some of these new business models around new materials? For me, I was always warned around risk on risk on risk. Um, if there isn't a supply chain of material already being produced for you to make your thing, your product, and that supply chain has to be set up and built, it's a risk that's allocated to someone external. Investors don't particularly like that. They really want to know that if you were to turn on the machine and produce the product and you got a massive order from a huge retail company, you could fulfill that huge order. So what does that look like? It looks like choosing a business either that knows it can buy an awful lot of something to make an awful lot of something easily, or it's a business that's a bit more long term, a bit more future thinking, but might hit a load of sustainability boxes, such as, renewable materials that support marine ecosystems. And I know you've worked in a few algae companies where that sounds true.
What were the other ones you mentioned? There was manufacturability, so drop in.
It's price, performance, and production. So production is scalability. Performance, is it as good as or better than the product existing on the market? And you can look at, if you're making a bioplastic or a biodegradable plastic, which plastics does it currently replace in the market? And does it do the same job from a material, from a mechanical and physical properties perspective, but it has the advantaged or added value if it does something like it biodegrades within a certain time. So there's your performance, but the production, its scalability is, does it drop into existing manufacturing infrastructure? If it doesn't, and you have to go and buy a new machine to make it, then people have to buy the machine plus your material, and there's a risk on risk. So if it was new, you had to buy a new feedstock from a supply chain that isn't there yet, there's a risk. If you're producing a product that the buyer doesn't know will actually meet the performance, there's a risk. And if they have to build a new machine to use your feedstock to make your product, to then sell your product to the market, there's a risk on risk on risk. And you're never going to get that past an investor.
So, what's your view on waste-based materials then and chemicals? Because it's something that I'm personally very interested in, if nothing else, from the sheer volumes of waste, whether that's from agricultural residues and leftovers in the field, or organic food waste, or pulp forestry and pulp waste, there's a lot of innovation in that space. There's a lot of obvious need for it. But then a lot of investors say that waste isn't a product. And like you said, it's a risk because where's that coming from? In what quantities can you guarantee you are reliant on someone else's supply chain? So what's your view on that? Because I'm personally quite excited by it. There's lots going on, but I can definitely see where some of the pitfalls are. Can companies overcome those pitfalls?
Brilliant. I like it. I really like it, Rachel. There's two definitions there. Agricultural and forestry residue is a residue, not a waste. Whereas something like food waste or municipal solid waste, which is mixed waste recycling, I've got a specialist background in that space. That is classed as a waste because the waste terminology is literally, it's unwanted. But if it's come off an agricultural forestry, it's still a resource material that isn't dangerous to the environment because it's just part of nature. It's part of the natural cycle. Whereas waste of human beings, municipal waste, that can be potentially hazardous to the environment, or if it's built up in a society. So there's a definition there. The waste, municipal waste, that falls under environmental permit regulations across Europe and under the Waste Framework Directive. For me, and I've had conversations over the years, that material is as repeatable all the way around the world as any other material. Because where there are humans, there's always municipal waste. And it's just a varying amount of food waste versus plastic versus textile versus paper and card. There's loads of cellulose in there. If you can get the cellulose out, you can turn it to sugar. You can make all the chemicals under the sun through fermentation technologies, and that's industrial biotechnology.
And there's been a lot of studies about waste composition as well, like I was saying earlier about from the Western world, a lot of electronics and higher value goods that, I mean, it just seems crazy to me that they just go into a pile somewhere. But there are companies looking at metal extraction, etc. And then in the global south, more organic waste. I've just been on the Mass Challenge judging panel, and there's some amazing technologies across India, across Africa, and Southeast Asia that are really utilizing waste, both municipal and plastic based and man-made, but also the organic waste as well. We've been talking for quite a while, Dan.
Yeah, well, eutectic and ionic fluids seem to be a big topic for the waste electricals area. Anything that pulls out those critical raw materials that we need in batteries and electronics. It is crazy that we're having questionable mining practices around the world to pull out these materials to go into our electric vehicles, into our mobile phones and our computers, and all we're doing is sending them off to be burnt and extracted in developing countries without regulated processes or safety regulation, or it's ending up in landfill. And these are finite materials.
There's going to be a war about it at some point. It's either going to be water and or critical minerals. Something to look forward to.
And if we haven't found replacements for silver and gold, which are conductive materials, or cobalt and lithium to go into our batteries, if we haven't found renewable replacements for those, carbon-based, then we're going to struggle if we keep wasting them. So they are perfect feedstocks to go into the products of today. But you mentioned food waste, and food waste is a big one because around, certainly in the UK and Europe, there's a big focus on collecting food waste. We have technologies like anaerobic digestion. Anaerobic digestion takes a mixed feedstock. Food waste is a mixed feedstock. That's what it is. But once you feed it to anaerobes, they will produce a stable biogas that's very predictable, full of methane. That methane is a building block in the same way for fossil-based gas is a feedstock for the chemical industry. That methane can be used as a feedstock for the chemicals industry. The cellulose that comes out, if you can turn the cellulose to sugar from municipal waste, from paper, from card, or the remaining cellulose from having washed waste food matter, that sugar is as good as anything to feed any biotech process. And biotech, with engineering biology, it's starting to have its day again. It's going through another cycle of investment and government support. But you can understand in places like UK and Europe, where there isn't a lot of oil and gas, and we're shutting down effectively our petrochemical industry, which is moving to Asia and China, that starting to invest in biotech makes total sense, because you mentioned forestry and agricultural residue. We got lots of that. There's loads of sugar in that. And we can build an industrial biotech industry on those residue materials without having to affect food crop. And then everything we pull out of municipal solid waste can either go through AD and be turned into materials and chemicals, or we turn it direct through other processes. So I think you've hit the nail on the head when we talk about residues versus wastes. I think it's all but
Really good point.
important, and that is actually feedstocks that we're rich in Europe.
And as you were just speaking, I was thinking about Maine, the state of Maine in the US, and we've talked a lot about the technologies and the processes and the feedstocks and what innovators especially need to do to be able to really have a place at the table in future economies. But let's talk a bit about governments as well. I touched on it with Traceless. They've had really, really significant backing from German government officials at a federal and a regional level. But Maine as well is really sticking their neck out, if you like, and realizing that their industries there around fishing and particularly utilizing crab and lobster shells, they're creating a whole ecosystem. They're wanting to attract entrepreneurs from all over the world. They've set up a blue economy, blue technology program earlier this year. So when we talk about governments, we're not just talking about regulation. I feel like there's a bit of a bun fight going on at the moment with countries competing with each other to attract entrepreneurs, to build economies and industries of the future, whether that's off the back of industries that they've got at the moment, like talking about waste residues and waste streams, or completely new industries, and not just government setting regulation and hitting people over the head with a stick, but actually seeing the commercial opportunity here to transition their populations and their industries. So I talked about Maine, I've talked about Germany. Australia is an interesting one with huge ag industries and oil industries and what they're doing over there. South Korea is just steaming ahead when it comes to bio. I know Singapore's always been at the forefront as well. Dan, do you have a view on which countries you think are going to be the most successful, and unfortunately whether the UK is going to keep pace?
So that's a big question, that is. Well, America's pummeled money into, and it always does, it pummels money into large scale investment to build stuff. It tends to build stuff that isn't ready for commercialization. And if it fails, it builds it again until it's right. It's a very different model to what's in Europe, where you don't build stuff until you know it's going to work. And so something in between is important. But in America, you tend to get more investment off less convincing. In Europe, you tend to get less investment over more convincing. So it's hard. Something in between is needed.
Are you talking about a government level or private investment?
In Europe, you get higher government investment support because it doesn't have the private sector investment that you have in the US. And the reason why we have such grant public funding in Europe is for that very reason. It's to counterbalance the fact that the private sector is more risk adverse and there isn't as much money in Europe to invest in new risky scale up technologies and materials. In America, everyone's an investor. Even the taxi drivers have stocks and shares.
Yeah, it's a very commercially centric. Everybody has a finger in some pie.
But they have different state support. You know, they don't have state healthcare, and they don't have the pension schemes that we have. So everybody's an investor because you taught that effectively from
Day one.
from their culture, from their systems. I think that the time will come, and I'm seeing it. The rise of Africa. Africa has an incredible amount of resources. It is a huge continent, and I think India know this. I think China know this. They're a blank canvas, so they have the opportunity to copy the best of Europe and the US and not have to go through the same pains that we've had to go through with a rising and a declining oil industry. It's funny, I was reading recently, Rachel, that India and the coal industry in India was tracking China in the same way as from 2010, in the same way as China was growing its coal industry and sector alongside renewables. India started, it's a bit delayed because India is a little bit further down the track when it comes to starting to grow economies, but it's going to be a huge economy. India has actually demonstrated that its coal industry, its scaling growth, has started to tether off much earlier than what was predicted if it followed the Chinese model. The reason being renewables, renewable energy, wind and solar, they have become so cheap and so deployable at scale that it's become more economic sense for India to grow its economy on renewables than it was on the coal industry. So this is a huge huge shift, and it gives me a lot of confidence. What I'm hoping is we see the same shift in the materials and chemicals sector as we do in the renewables. So renewables have hit price point, they've hit productivity, you can manufacture them at scale, and the performance of that electricity coming from renewables is as good as any. But you turn it on day one with initial capex, and it keeps running. It gives you 20 years of free energy.
Did you see IKEA had released individual solar panels that customers can now put on their houses or balconies? Did you see that? So kind of portable, extremely high performing solar panels.
I was aware that the British government didn't want to bring them in too quickly because A, they didn't know how they worked along safety criteria, and B, they didn't know how it would disrupt the electrical power grid in the UK, because these things plug directly into your plug socket. So that's the level of convenience that gets the consumer. Have they got the price? Have they got the convenience? And does it do the thing that they need it to do? All of those things.
So again, whilst you were talking, there were two or three things I was just thinking about, and we are going to do a whole other podcast about Asia. There's innovators that are setting up shop there. Obviously, China's making a play for bio. And just the manufacturing capabilities and speed. You share an idea with somebody and they come back the next day and it's all done, it's costed up, and they've basically got a prototype for you. I hear a lot about the speed of the manufacturing in Asia. And whether this obsession with innovation is something that the Western world ties themselves in knots over. Just get on and do it. Just have an idea, build a prototype, manufacture it, get it out there, get it to your target market pretty quickly. But we will do a whole other podcast about Asia, about what's going on over there, but also about the flow of talent and technologies that we're seeing setting up shop over there as well. There was one other thing. Drivers of materials and chemicals innovation, consumers being a huge part of that. Again, not just in terms of concerns, but also in terms of desires. Luxury good brands, luxury houses are embracing alternative bio-based textiles because these are unique, they're forward thinking, they're covetable, they're gorgeous, and it doesn't just have to be a stick that's driving businesses to adopt different materials and chemicals, but there's also the positive story around it and the growth opportunity too. I do wonder sometimes if there's an ick factor from consumers. Would you wear a jumper that you knew was made out of bacteria?
Uh,
Or does
I
that
mean,
even matter? Does that even matter?
when we suddenly realise how many bacteria is on our skin and on our hands, and then we're eating kefir, uh,
Yeah, I was about to say in our yogurts.
it feels like we'd gone through this sterile bleach phase in humanity where everything had to be super clean and bugs and microorganisms were dirty things and don't play in the soil. But actually what we're learning is there's a microbiome for every part of our body. And when that microbiome, either there's a particular microbe missing from the microbiome set, or we're wiping it out through antibiotics, overuse of bleach, overuse of surfactants, cleaning our dishes, and we're not washing them properly. All of these things are impacting what makes us. And I think there's a really weird statistic that actually the human body is like half of it is effectively bacteria. So what makes an individual? Actually, many millions, if not billions of bacteria makes the individual. So I think we've got to, and this is part of the disconnect from nature that we were drawn to because it sells product. We were always sold materials that were felt to be clean and pure and and this whole thing around we don't do secondhand. Well, secondhand and thrifting and reuse, people are starting to embrace the old things again in a very new way. And if you think about where those items might have been previously, you probably wouldn't buy them. But
That's cost of living. I'm a mum of a 4-year-old. Pretty much everything I buy her is on vintage. The valuation of vintage has massively increased over the last couple of years. And again, what are the drivers of change? What are the drivers of different technologies? A lot of brands in the textile and apparel space and footwear space have realized where this trend is going. I would wager driven by cost of living rather than anything else. Maybe even on top of that, just a fatigue around how much stuff is pumped out into the world to the point where we don't need half the stuff in our houses. I'd love to get someone on the podcast that can really talk and share much deeper insights into consumer behavior and buying behavior. But just talking about resale, a lot of brands have jumped on that bandwagon. They've started to either work with resale startups and platforms or create their own. So when they've seen a commercial opportunity to increase the lifetime value of that product and of that customer. So change is happening. It's happening in pockets for different reasons with different drivers. But when you look at that bigger picture, there's a lot going on. There's a lot that businesses are facing.
Rachel, I recently bought 2 new t-shirts, new tees, very smart. They fit, and that's the reason why I bought them. But I wasn't going to buy them. I think it was 2 for £35. Reasonable. It's not too expensive. It's not too cheap. So it's in the right bracket. And when the person I was with said, "Have you looked at the label? Are they 100% cotton?" And I saw
Organic
that they were
cotton.
100, and I just had to go for it. And you think if it was made from polyester, you know that it's been made by huge chemical plants starting in the Middle East that have fed petrochemical plants maybe or plastic processes in Europe, and it's been turned into garments. And then you worry about the microfibers, you wonder about the microplastics, you wonder about the ingestion of these microplastics, there's still questions around the health impacts, but we certainly know that the impacts on the environment of microplastics. And we know that fast fashion is just a huge mountain of waste that is creating this linear society. So if you think about cotton industry, okay, there's those who will say it uses a lot of water, pesticides, herbicides, but there are different supply chains and economic models that feed the cotton system that support farmers around the world that can support regenerative agriculture. And if I'm still getting 2 shirts for £35 and I'm gonna keep them for the next 5 to 10 years because 'cause they're nice shirts, then it's doing the job that the original fashion market had always done. So then is there a place for us to move to 100% cotton if actually the end of life outcomes for health and for the environment, we can recycle them back in, we can compost them? Surely that's gotta be a better way to go. And maybe it's about finding more sustainable cottons, as you say, but it's got to hit that scalability. I want people to think about retaining and holding on to clothing rather than buying one thing and then I'm bored of that, or I've worn it once, I've had my photos taken, I can't be photographed wearing that same dress again. Wear the dress 1,000 times. I think it's cooler.
If it lasts that long, because I mean, oh gosh, I'm a consumer. I have to keep remembering that I spend money. I decide where I spend my money. I don't know if I'm unusual in this, but I do look at the performance element. If I'm going to a hot country over the summer, I want to buy clothes that are going to keep me cool in the right material and the right color. But then if I'm going to spend money, I also want to make sure that that item is going to last a while. And so much doesn't nowadays. We've had a race to the bottom in terms of manufacturing. You're buying badly made things for still quite a lot of money. Got 5 minutes, Dan. I want to end this podcast by asking you which technology or group of technologies are you most excited about?
Right, that's a grand question. Um, well, my big concern is seeing with the conflicts in the Middle East, spike in recycled plastic, mechanically recycled plastic, and the value of it and the demand for it. And I only see that because over the past 10 years, we've invested in sunk assets. We're not seeing that rise in value and demand in chemically recycled currently, partly because the infrastructure in chemical recycling and recovering some of those valuable polymer materials to go into new products, that infrastructure is not yet fully commercial around the world. And because of that, you're seeing pullback from large chemical companies, and you're seeing those companies scaling those advanced thermal, advanced chemical technologies. Some of them are going under, some of them are putting their investment on hold. I think that's sad, and I can understand why they're doing that because of rises in energy cost risk and the ability to get financing and insuring. But I think this is the cycle we need to with support, have tolerance, patience, and really bed in. And if we're going to make investment, go for the investment anyway, because we don't want to be in another boom and bust cycle. We want to see these technologies hold in the marketplace, even if it hurts. As a society, we need them to work. Otherwise, we're going to be beholden and coupled to oil and gas. So anything that can do scale, I'm interested in. Pyrolysis can do scale. Problem is, pyrolysis produces a chemical soup. Anything that upgrades that pyrolysis oil is really exciting and feeds it straight into the chemicals set of existing petrochem today. Anything that is biodegradable that can replace fast fashion and packaging, because these are large volume markets producing materials that actually we're struggling to recycle at scale, and they're causing major pollution issues. So making sure that they are going to be food for nature, even if they get dropped in the ocean, on land, or they get recycled, it's always going to happen that any material is going to find its way into the environment. It's just inevitable, whether it's a big truck being backed into a river in Asia, or whether it's someone accidentally dropping a poo bag in the park. So make these materials readily available for nature. Again, that it's got to hit that price point, it's got to hit performance, and it's got to hit scalability. But for me, in order for these bio-based materials to really break through against existing incumbents, the barrier properties need to improve. And so there are some great companies out there that are developing novel biodegradable barriers that resist water and CO2 and oxygen and keep things fresh for longer, or keep the moisture out. And there are companies in the seaweed sector and the companies from the chemical sector that are looking to develop these barrier materials to go on card and paper, this whole scope to paperization from plastics to paper. If we can get those barrier materials sorted, then these novel materials will have their place in the market, just as long as it hits price point.
We will do a whole podcast on that, coatings and barrier materials, barrier technologies, definitely. I mean, from my point of view, anything that valorizes waste, and I think the ones that will succeed are going to be feedstock agnostic. So a technology or a process that can work across any type of waste and or degradation. There's some incredible companies out there that are creating technologies that can eat plastic waste and reduce it to nothing. So anything waste based, I'm really keeping an eye on whether that's getting rid of it or valorizing it and upcycling it. That's my particular interest area and the things I'm very excited about. And waste is only going to increase according to the World Bank. So yes, there are questions around security and consistency around feedstocks, but they are out there. Many companies are going to be able to tap into that and create a business around it. We're going to do wrap up because I've got to go.
Well, it's been thoroughly enjoyable, Rachel.
Yeah, it has. Thank you for listening to the Material Advantage podcast. We're covering everything that business leaders need to know about the materials and chemicals transition. We'd love to know your suggestions for topics for future episodes and obviously guests as well. And don't forget to subscribe.